Professor Vexthor tapped his clawed finger against the podium control panel, and the holographic display shifted to show something that made half the auditorium gasp in unison. A massive creature swam through dark water, its mouth open to reveal rows of triangular teeth. The great white shark rotated slowly in the projection, every detail of its predatory design visible to the horrified cadets. The professor explained in his clinical tone that this was just one of thousands of apex predators that shared Earth with humans, creatures that had evolved over millions of years to hunt and kill with ruthless efficiency. More images appeared in rapid succession, each one seemingly more terrifying than the last. A saltwater crocodile lurked in murky water, its eyes barely visible above the surface. A polar bear stood on its hind legs, towering and powerful, its claws extended. A tiger crouched in tall grass, muscles coiled and ready to spring. Professor Vexthor explained that humans had not evolved in isolation on some safe continent, but had spread across their entire planet, encountering and competing with each of these predators. The cadets sat frozen as the professor detailed how early humans had no natural weapons, no claws or fangs or venom, yet had somehow survived in environments where any of these creatures could kill them easily. A Quillarian cadet named Liss raised a shaking hand and asked how humans possibly defended themselves against such monsters. Professor Vexthor's amber eyes gleamed as he answered that humans had developed something far more dangerous than claws or teeth. They had developed intelligence and endurance and the willingness to hunt in coordinated groups. The hologram changed to show ancient humans running across a savanna, chasing a large four-legged animal. The professor explained persistence hunting, a technique where humans simply followed their prey for hours or even days until the animal collapsed from exhaustion. The display showed thermal imaging of a human running under Earth's sun, and Professor Vexthor pointed out the heat dissipation occurring across the human skin. He explained the sweat glands, millions of them covering the human body, allowing for a cooling system more efficient than anything most species possessed. While other Earth predators had to stop and rest to avoid overheating, humans could continue running indefinitely. The professor noted that this ability meant humans could outlast almost any other creature on their planet, that they were essentially unstoppable pursuers. Several cadets shifted uncomfortably in their seats, and Jake heard someone whisper something about being chased by something that never gives up. Professor Vexthor pulled up a new set of data, this time focusing on human physical capabilities under stress. Charts showed reaction times that seemed impossibly fast for a species of Earth's size. Graphs displayed bone density measurements that exceeded safety standards for most construction materials used on garden worlds. The professor showed video footage of human athletes performing feats that defied what the cadets understood about biology. A human jumped over a height nearly equal to their own body length. Another human lifted a weight more than twice their mass. A human ran at speeds that would require mechanical assistance for most species present. Then came the footage that made even Jake wince slightly. A human female, small in stature compared to Jake himself, stood beside a ground vehicle that had somehow trapped her offspring underneath. The video showed her gripping the vehicle's frame and lifting, her face contorted with effort, muscles straining visibly beneath her skin. The vehicle rose just enough for someone else to pull the child free. Professor Vexthor paused the image at the moment of maximum lift and explained the concept of hysterical strength, a state humans could enter during extreme stress where their normal physical limitations were temporarily overridden. The professor described the human adrenal response in detail, explaining how the body flooded itself with chemicals that suppressed pain, increased strength, and sharpened focus. He showed medical scans of human brains during this state, highlighting the areas that became more active and those that shut down. Fear responses were dampened, he explained, while aggression centers activated. The body prioritized immediate survival over long-term health, sometimes causing humans to injure themselves through their own strength. A Thalorian cadet asked in a crystalline voice whether humans could control this response, and Professor Vexthor replied that it activated automatically in response to perceived threats, making humans unpredictable and potentially dangerous when cornered. The lecture shifted to diseases and immune systems, and the atmosphere in the hall became even more tense. Professor Vexthor displayed images of viruses and bacteria that had plagued humanity throughout history. Smallpox appeared on screen, and he described how it had killed hundreds of millions of humans over centuries. Plague followed, then influenza, then dozens of other diseases with names the cadets struggled to pronounce even with their translators. The professor explained that these pathogens had shaped human evolution, that only the humans with the strongest immune systems survived to reproduce, creating a species with defensive biology that treated constant microbial warfare as normal. Jake noticed several cadets had moved their seats even further away from him, and one had pulled out what looked like a personal air filtration device. Zrix remained beside him but had retracted his tentacles completely, a Palaxian sign of extreme discomfort. The bioluminescent patterns on his skin had shifted to a pale green color that Jake had learned meant anxiety. Professor Vexthor continued without pause, explaining that humans carried trillions of microorganisms in their bodies at all times, that their digestive systems alone hosted more bacterial cells than the human body had cells of its own. The holographic display showed the human digestive tract, and Professor Vexthor described it as a chemical warfare facility that could break down an enormous variety of organic materials. He listed foods that humans consumed regularly, and with each item the cadets' reactions grew stronger. Fermented products filled with live bacteria that humans deliberately ingested for health benefits, fungal growths that would be toxic to most species but humans considered delicacies, decayed plant matter pickled in acid that humans called vegetables. The professor showed images of prepared animal flesh, cooked muscle tissue that humans ate daily, and several herbivorous species in the audience turned away or covered their visual organs. Then Professor Vexthor introduced the concept of capsaicin, and even Jake had to suppress a smile at the auditorium's reaction. The professor explained that this chemical compound evolved in earth plants as a defense mechanism, that it triggered pain receptors and caused intense burning sensations in most creatures. Humans, he continued, had somehow decided they enjoyed this pain and actively sought out plants with higher concentrations of the chemical. A video played showing a human eating what the caption identified as a ghost pepper, one of the most potent sources of capsaicin on Earth. The human's face turned bright red, sweat poured down their skin, and they clearly appeared to be in distress, yet they continued eating and even smiled at the camera. A Dendari cadet stood and asked with genuine confusion why any species would voluntarily cause themselves pain. Professor Vexthor replied that humans seemed to view controlled suffering as entertainment or character building, that they regularly engaged in activities specifically designed to be difficult or dangerous. He showed images of humans climbing sheer rock faces without safety equipment, jumping from aircraft for recreation, and running marathons in extreme heat. The professor noted that humans appeared to seek out challenges that would sensibly be avoided, as if they were constantly testing the limits of their own capabilities. The presentation moved to human space exploration, and Professor Vexthor displayed early rocket designs from Earth's history. He showed footage of spectacular failures, rockets exploding on launch pads or breaking apart during flight. The professor explained that these disasters killed numerous humans, yet the space programs continued. He displayed a timeline showing humanity's progress from the first primitive satellites to landing on their own moon in less than 70 years. For species that typically took centuries to develop safe space travel, this reckless speed seemed insane. The morning light from the twin suns of Kepler 9 streamed through the massive windows of the Grand Lecture Hall, casting geometric shadows across rows of seats that curved upward like an ancient amphitheater. Cadets from across the galaxy filtered into the hall, their voices creating a symphony of clicks, chirps, hums, and occasional recognizable words. Some walked on 2 legs, others on 4 or 6, and a few simply floated using biological or technological means. The air filtration systems worked overtime to accommodate the various atmospheric preferences, creating subtle zones of different gas mixtures throughout the space. Jake Morrison climbed the steps toward the back rows, his standard-issue boots making heavy sounds against the metal stairs. He had learned during his first week at the Galactic Naval Academy that sitting in the back reduced the number of stares he received. Being the only human among 200 cadets made him a curiosity at best and a source of nervous whispers at worst. His roommate Zrix followed close behind, tentacles gripping the railing as the Palaxian's bioluminescent skin pulsed with excited blue patterns. Zrix had been babbling about Professor Vexthor's reputation since breakfast, apparently unaware that Jake was only half listening. The lecture hall filled quickly, and Jake noticed the usual clustering of species. The Quillarians sat together near the front, their rabbit-like ears twitching as they whispered among themselves. A group of Tellurians occupied the middle section, their crystalline bodies refracting light in rainbow patterns. The Dendari delegation spread across several rows, their plant-like appendages occasionally reaching out to touch one another in their species' version of conversation. Jake slumped into his reinforced seat, specially designed to accommodate human weight and bone density, and pulled out his data tablet. Professor Vexthor entered through the main doors with the confident stride of someone who had given this lecture dozens of times. The Crithian stood nearly 7 feet tall, his silver scales catching the light as he moved. 4 amber eyes scanned the auditorium with an intelligence that made many cadets shift uncomfortably. His reputation preceded him as the toughest instructor in the xenobiology department, someone who never softened the harsh truths about life in a diverse galaxy. Vexthor reached the podium, set down his materials with deliberate precision, and waited for complete silence before speaking. The professor's voice carried easily through the hall, aided by the acoustic design and translation devices most cadets wore. He welcomed them to Xenobiology 101 and explained that over the semester, they would study the incredible diversity of life that made up the Galactic Union. However, he continued, they would begin with something special. Today's lecture would focus on one of the newest members of the Union, a species from a world so hostile that it defied conventional understanding of how sentient life could evolve. The lights dimmed and a holographic image appeared above the podium, showing a blue and green planet wrapped in swirling white clouds. Earth appeared in the center of the room, rotating slowly as data stream scrolled alongside it. Professor Vexthor began with the basics, explaining that Earth was classified as a Class 12 death world, a designation that made several cadets gasp audibly. The professor methodically listed the factors that earned this classification. The gravity was nearly double that of most garden worlds where civilized species typically evolved. The atmospheric oxygen content was so high that it would be toxic to many species in the room. The planet experienced extreme temperature variations, violent weather patterns, and harbored countless forms of dangerous life. Jake felt eyes turning toward him, dozens of alien gazes seeking out the representative of this nightmare world. He kept his expression neutral and his eyes on the hologram, even as Zrix's tentacle gently touched his arm in what the Palaxian probably thought was a comforting gesture. Professor Vexthor pulled up images of human skeletal structure, the bones rendered in transparent blue against a dark background. He pointed out the density required to support human weight under such intense gravity, comparing it to the lighter, more delicate structures of species from more hospitable worlds. The professor moved through his presentation with the precision of a surgeon and the detachment of a scientist. He showed cross-sections of human muscle tissue, explaining the fiber composition and the raw strength it provided. He displayed the human cardiovascular system, noting how the heart had to work constantly against gravity's pull to circulate blood throughout the body. A Quillarian cadet near the front raised her hand and asked nervously if humans were in constant pain from living under such conditions. Vexthor replied that humans knew nothing else, that they were born into this struggle and considered it normal existence. The lecture continued with Earth's atmospheric composition. Professor Vexthor explained that the oxygen levels that made human life possible would cause oxidative stress and cellular damage to many species present. He showed studies of what happened when species from low-oxygen worlds were exposed to Earth's atmosphere without proper protection. The images were not pleasant, and several cadets looked away. The professor noted clinically that humans breathed this corrosive gas constantly, that their cells had adapted to harness its destructive potential for energy production. Weather patterns came next, and the holographic display shifted to show massive spiral formations over Earth's oceans. Professor Vexthor described hurricanes, tropical cyclones with wind speeds that could tear apart standard colony structures. He showed tornadoes rotating columns of air that could level entire settlements in minutes. Lightning storms appeared on screen, electrical discharges with more energy than many plasma weapons. The professor explained that humans built their cities knowing these events would occur regularly, that they simply reinforced their structures and continued living in these danger zones. A video began playing, showing what Earth natives called a tsunami. The massive wave crashed into a coastal area, water moving with unstoppable force. Professor Vexthor's voice remained steady as he explained that Earth's tectonic activity meant such events were common, that the planet's surface was composed of moving plates that ground against each other, creating earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. Humans, he noted, simply rebuilt after these disasters and returned to the same locations. Several cadets whispered among themselves, the universal translator picking up words like madness and incomprehensible. The professor then addressed Earth's microbial life, and this seemed to disturb the audience more than anything previous. He explained that every surface on Earth teemed with bacteria, that the air itself carried countless microorganisms. Humans, he continued, were born into this soup of potential infection and developed immune systems that waged constant warfare against invading organisms. He showed microscopic images of bacteria and viruses, explaining that these had killed millions of humans throughout their history. Yet the species continued to thrive. A cadet from a sterile world species actually stood up and left the lecture hall, looking visibly ill. Jake sank lower in his seat as the whispers grew louder. He could hear fragments of conversation even without a translator. Dangerous and primitive, and how are they even here, were common themes. Zrix had stopped offering comforting gestures and now sat very still, his bioluminescent patterns dimmed to a worried purple. Other cadets had physically moved their seats away, creating a small empty zone around Jake as if he might be carrying some earth plague. Professor Vexthor either did not notice or did not care about the growing unease in the room. The holographic display shifted again, this time showing charts and graphs comparing human physiology to other species. Reaction times, bone density, muscle strength, temperature tolerance, and dozens of other metrics appeared in rapid succession. In nearly every category, humans fell outside the normal range, often dramatically so. Professor Vexthor walked the audience through each comparison, his voice never changing tone, never expressing judgment, simply presenting the facts as if he were describing an interesting geological formation rather than a sentient species. As the presentation continued, Jake noticed something shift in the room's atmosphere. What had started as academic curiosity had transformed into something else, something that felt uncomfortably like fear. Cadets who had greeted him pleasantly that morning now avoided his gaze. The usual friendly chatter had been replaced by nervous silence punctuated by occasional whispers. Jake's hands clenched into fists on his desk, his jaw tightening as Professor Vexthor moved to the next section of his lecture, promising the audience that they had not yet seen the most disturbing aspects of human evolution and culture. Professor Vexthor pulled up images of the Voyager probes, simple machines that humans had launched into deep space decades before making first contact with the Galactic Union. He showed the golden records attached to these probes, containing sounds and images from Earth along with mathematical instructions for playing them. The professor explained that humans had essentially announced their presence to the entire galaxy, without knowing if anyone was listening, or whether those listeners might be hostile. He called it either remarkable courage or dangerous stupidity, possibly both. The hologram showed statistics comparing human technological development to other species. In almost every category, humans had progressed faster, but with higher casualty rates and more spectacular failures. The professor noted that human scientists often conducted experiments that other species would consider too risky, that human engineers built structures and machines that pushed beyond established safety margins, and that human explorers ventured into environments that were barely survivable. The pattern suggested a species with either very high intelligence, combined with very low self-preservation instincts, or a fundamentally different risk assessment psychology. By this point in the lecture, the atmosphere in the grand lecture hall had transformed completely. The initial academic curiosity had evolved into something approaching genuine fear. Cadets whispered urgently to one another, and Jake caught fragments of conversation about whether humans should even be allowed in the academy. A few cadets near him had actually changed seats entirely, moving to different sections of the auditorium. Liz, the Quilarian who had asked the earlier question, kept glancing at Jake with wide eyes, her long ears flat against her head in a clear sign of distress. Zrix finally worked up the courage to whisper to Jake, asking if all of this was really true. Jake nodded slightly, not trusting himself to speak without his frustration showing. Everything the professor had said was technically accurate, but the way it was being presented made humans sound like monsters rather than people. Professor Vexthor had carefully selected the most frightening aspects of human biology and culture, while ignoring everything else that made humanity what it was. A brave Thylorian cadet raised his hand, his crystalline body refracting the light into nervous patterns. He asked the question that seemed to be on everyone's mind, whether humans were actually safe to have studying alongside other species at the academy. The hall fell completely silent, waiting for Professor Vexthor's answer, and Jake felt every eye in the room turn toward him once again. Before the professor could respond, Jake felt something inside him snap. His chair scraped loudly against the floor as he stood up, the sound echoing through the quiet auditorium like a thunderclap. The sound of Jake's chair scraping against the floor echoed through the lecture hall like a challenge, and every conversation stopped instantly. 200 pairs of eyes from dozens of different species locked onto the lone human as he stood in the back row, his jaw clenched and his hands gripping the desk in front of him. Professor Vexthor paused mid-sentence, his 4 amber eyes focusing on Jake with an expression that might have been curiosity or perhaps something else entirely. The silence stretched for several heartbeats, broken only by the quiet hum of the air filtration systems working to maintain the various atmospheric zones throughout the hall. Jake took a deep breath and sat back down, realizing that standing had been a reflexive reaction to his frustration, rather than a planned action. He had no idea what he would have said if he had walked down to the podium at that moment, and making a scene would only reinforce whatever negative impressions the other cadets were forming. Zrix's tentacle touched his arm again, this time with a gentle squeeze that seemed to ask if he was all right. Jake nodded slightly, keeping his eyes fixed on Professor Vexthor, who regarded him for another moment before turning back to his presentation with what might have been the slightest hint of a smile. The professor's next words cut through the tension like a blade. He announced that they would now examine human psychology and cultural development, subjects that he promised would be even more illuminating than the physical characteristics they had already discussed. The holographic display shifted to show images of human warfare throughout history, and Jake felt his stomach sink. Ancient battlefields appeared first, showing warriors with primitive weapons clashing in brutal close combat. The images progressed through time, showing increasingly sophisticated methods of organized violence, from cavalry charges to trench warfare to modern conflicts with weapons that could level entire cities. Professor Vexthor displayed casualty statistics from Earth's major wars, and the numbers were staggering even to Jake, who had studied human history. Millions dead in conflicts that sometimes lasted years or even decades. The professor explained the concept of total war, where entire populations mobilized for conflict, where civilian and military targets became indistinguishable, where the goal was not just to defeat an enemy army but to destroy their capacity and will to fight. Several cadets made sounds of distress that their translators could not quite capture, universal expressions of horror that needed no interpretation. The presentation showed human soldiers in combat situations, and Professor Vexthor began describing human pain tolerance in detail. Medical studies appeared on screen, showing humans continuing to function with injuries that would incapacitate most other species. Broken bones, severe blood loss, damaged organs, and yet the humans in the footage kept moving and fighting. The professor showed a particularly striking image of a human soldier who had lost a limb, yet continued to direct their squad to safety. He explained that human nervous systems could be overridden by willpower and training, that humans could literally choose to ignore signals their bodies sent telling them to stop. A video clip played showing a human climbing a mountain, and at first, the cadets seemed confused about why this was included. Then the camera angle shifted, revealing that the human had artificial legs, mechanical replacements for limbs lost in some previous incident. Professor Vexthor explained that humans who lost body parts often refused to accept disability as a limitation, that they developed technology to replace what was lost and then used those replacements to accomplish things that many, fully healthy members of other species would never attempt. The human in the video reached the mountain summit and raised their arms in triumph, and the image froze there. The lecture took an even darker turn as Professor Vexthor began discussing human territorial behavior and social bonding. He displayed brain scans showing the neural activity when humans formed emotional attachments, explaining that the process was remarkably indiscriminate. Humans bonded not just with their own species but with other creatures, with pets and working animals, and even with plants or inanimate objects. The professor showed images of humans mourning deceased pets with the same intensity they would mourn family members, explained how humans named their vehicles and ships and sometimes even their weapons. Then came the warning that made several cadets visibly tense. Professor Vexthor stated that a human who had formed a pack bond with someone became extremely protective of that individual or group, often to irrational degrees. He showed historical examples of humans fighting overwhelming odds to protect bonded companions. A human who single-handedly held off an attacking force to buy time for others to escape. A human who carried a wounded friend through hostile territory for days without stopping. A human who refused to leave a dangerous situation because doing so would mean abandoning someone they cared about. The professor noted that this loyalty was admirable in theory but made humans unpredictable and potentially dangerous if they perceived a threat to their pack. Professor Vexthor returned to the subject of human diet, and the images that appeared made several cadets look away immediately. Prepared meat dishes filled the display, various forms of cooked animal flesh that humans consumed regularly. The professor explained that humans were apex omnivores, meaning they could digest an enormous variety of foods, including items that would be toxic to most species in the room. He brought up a chart showing the pH levels in human stomach acid, noting that it was strong enough to dissolve bone and kill most bacteria that might be present in food. The presentation on capsaicin returned, but this time Professor Vexthor expanded on the topic. He explained that humans had developed entire cuisines around spicy foods, that they competed to see who could tolerate the most painful chemical concentrations, that they cultivated plants specifically to produce higher levels of these defensive compounds. Video footage showed humans participating in eating contests involving extremely spicy foods, their faces red and streaming with sweat and tears, yet they continued eating and even appeared to be enjoying themselves. The professor noted that this behavior suggested either a malfunction in human pain processing or a psychological peculiarity that found pleasure in controlled suffering. Were examples of human recreational activities followed, each one seeming more incomprehensible than the last to the assembled cadets. Humans jumped out of aircraft with nothing but fabric parachutes to slow their descent. Humans dove deep underwater despite having no natural ability to breathe in that environment. Humans raced vehicles at speeds that would be fatal if anything went wrong. Humans climbed frozen waterfalls using metal picks and their own strength. Professor Vexthor compiled these examples into a pattern, explaining that humans seemed to constantly seek out danger and difficulty, even when such challenges served no practical purpose. The professor displayed psychological studies showing that humans who regularly engaged in these dangerous activities reported higher satisfaction with their lives. He explained that human brains released pleasure chemicals in response to overcoming challenges, that they were essentially neurologically rewarded for taking risks and pushing boundaries. This meant that the safest, most comfortable environment was often unsatisfying to humans, that they needed stimulation and challenge to feel fulfilled. The implications for long-term cohabitation with other species were concerning, Professor Vexthor noted, as what humans considered normal recreation might terrorize other species. The presentation shifted to human emotional complexity, and Professor Vexthor showed brain imaging studies that revealed patterns unlike those of most other species. He explained that humans could experience multiple contradictory emotions simultaneously, that they could feel happy and sad at the same time, or angry yet understanding, or afraid while still moving forward. This emotional complexity made human behavior difficult to predict, as their actions might not align with what seemed like their primary emotional state. The professor suggested this was an evolutionary adaptation to Earth's complex social environments, where humans needed to navigate intricate relationships while also surviving physical dangers. Jake's footsteps echoed through the silent lecture hall as he descended the stairs toward the podium, each step deliberate and measured despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. He could feel every eye tracking his movement, could sense the tension rippling through the assembled cadets like a physical force. Some leaned back in their seats as he passed, instinctively trying to create distance. Others sat frozen, perhaps afraid that any sudden movement might trigger some kind of violent response from the human walking through their midst. Zrix had made a small sound of concern when Jake stood up, but his roommate had not tried to stop him, and Jake was grateful for that. Professor Vexthor watched Jake's approach with those 4 amber eyes, his expression unreadable behind his silver scales. The Crithian did not move from his position at the podium, did not speak or gesture, simply waited as the human cadet crossed the distance between them. Jake's heart hammered against his ribs, but he kept his breathing steady and his face calm. He had no prepared speech, No carefully planned rebuttal to the professor's presentation. He had only his frustration at being portrayed as a monster, and his belief that his species deserved better than to be defined solely by their capacity for violence and survival. When Jake reached the podium, he stopped a respectful distance from Professor Vexthor and turned to face the auditorium. From this vantage point, he could see every cadet clearly, could read the fear and uncertainty written across dozens of alien faces. He took a moment to gather his thoughts, then began speaking in a voice that carried through the hall without needing amplification. He started by acknowledging that everything Professor Vexthor had presented was technically true, that he was not here to deny the facts about Earth or human biology or human history. However, he continued, context was everything, and the lecture had presented only one side of what it meant to be human. Jake addressed the issue of Earth's dangers first, explaining that yes, his homeworld was harsh by galactic standards, but that harshness had taught humans something vital. It had taught them cooperation, not just competition. He explained that humans survived not because they were the strongest or fastest or most dangerous creatures on Earth, but because they worked together. Early humans had formed communities, shared resources, protected each other's young, and passed knowledge from generation to generation. The dangers of Earth had not made humans into isolated predators, but into social creatures who understood that survival depended on supporting one another. The topic of human physical capabilities came next, and Jake reframed the information Professor Vexthor had presented. Yes, humans were strong because of Earth's gravity, but that strength made them useful for the physical demands of space travel and military service. Human bone density meant they could withstand impacts and stresses that would injure other species. Human endurance meant they could work longer hours in difficult conditions. Human pain tolerance meant they could continue functioning during emergencies when others might be incapacitated. These traits were not threats, Jake argued, but assets that made humans valuable members of the Galactic Union. Jake saw a few cadets nodding slightly, and he pressed on. He talked about human persistence hunting, acknowledging that yes, it sounded terrifying when presented as an unstoppable pursuit, but he explained that this same trait manifested in modern humans as determination and resilience. Humans did not give up easily on problems. They kept working toward solutions even when success seemed impossible. They persisted through failures and setbacks. This quality made them excellent researchers, engineers, and explorers. The same drive that once helped humans survive on the African savanna now pushed them to solve complex challenges and explore unknown territories. The subject of human immune systems and disease resistance came up, and Jake admitted this was perhaps the most valid concern. Humans did carry microorganisms that could potentially harm other species. However, he pointed out that human understanding of disease and infection control was incredibly advanced, precisely because humans had dealt with these threats throughout their evolution. Human medical knowledge had already helped other species. He mentioned the relief mission to Proxima Colony, where human doctors had volunteered to work with a plague outbreak. Their experience dealing with Earth pathogens had proven invaluable in developing treatments that saved thousands of lives across multiple species. Jake turned to the issue of human violence and warfare, and he knew this would be the hardest topic to address. He did not try to minimize or excuse human history. He acknowledged that humans had inflicted terrible violence on each other, that they had created weapons of mass destruction, that they had come close to destroying themselves multiple times. But, he continued, that was the key point. Humans had seen the worst that their species was capable of and had chosen to change. They had created international laws, established organizations dedicated to preventing war, and developed diplomatic solutions to conflicts that previous generations would have resolved through violence. He explained that a species that had never faced its own capacity for destruction might not understand the importance of restraint and cooperation. Humans knew what happened when conflicts escalated, knew the cost of war in a visceral way that could not be taught from books alone. This knowledge made them cautious about violence, made them value peace more deeply because they understood what the alternative looked like. Jake argued that a species that had learned these lessons through hard experience might actually be more trustworthy than one that had never been tested. The topic of human diet and the consumption of capsaicin actually made Jake smile slightly. Breaking the tension in his delivery, he acknowledged that human food preferences seemed bizarre to many species, but he reframed it as adaptability. Humans could eat a wider variety of foods than most species, which made them ideal for long-duration space missions and exploration of unknown worlds. The ability to derive nutrition from many different sources meant humans were less likely to face starvation in unfamiliar environments. As for eating spicy foods, Jake explained that humans enjoyed the challenge, the controlled discomfort that reminded them they were alive. It was not about seeking pain, but about testing their own limits in safe ways. Jake addressed the human tendency to seek out danger and difficulty, the recreational activities that Professor Vexthor had presented as evidence of human recklessness. He explained that humans called this building character, and it served an important psychological purpose. By voluntarily facing controlled challenges, humans developed confidence and problem-solving skills. Mountain climbing taught planning and perseverance. Skydiving taught courage and trust in equipment and training. Marathon running taught mental discipline. These activities were not pointless risks, but training exercises that made humans better at handling unexpected emergencies. A human who had learned to stay calm while jumping out of an aircraft was more likely to remain composed during a genuine crisis. The discussion moved to human emotional complexity, and Jake saw this as an opportunity to show a different side of humanity. He explained that humans could hold contradictory emotions simultaneously, and while this might make them unpredictable, it also made them empathetic. Humans could be angry at someone while still understanding their perspective. They could feel afraid while still choosing to act. They could experience grief while also feeling gratitude for what they had lost. This emotional range allowed humans to connect with others on multiple levels, to find common ground even with beings completely different from themselves. Jake talked about human pack bonding, expanding on what Professor Vexthor had mentioned but providing different context. Yes, humans formed strong attachments, sometimes to unexpected things, but this capacity for connection was a strength, not a weakness. Humans bonded with their ships, which made them better at maintaining and caring for their vessels. Humans bonded with alien species, which made them excellent at building diplomatic relationships. Humans bonded with their squad mates, which created cohesive teams that worked well under pressure. The loyalty that Professor Vexthor had presented as potentially dangerous was actually one of humanity's greatest assets. Jake pulled out his personal data tablet and projected his own images onto the holographic display, replacing Professor Vexthor's clinical presentations with something more personal. He showed pictures of human children playing together in parks, their faces bright with laughter. He showed families gathering for meals, multiple generations sharing food and stories. He showed cities at night, billions of lights representing humans living peacefully alongside one another. He showed humans of different backgrounds working together on construction projects, medical teams, scientific research, and artistic endeavors. Professor Vexthor displayed examples of human art, literature, and music, but even these were presented in an unsettling context. He showed artwork depicting violence and death, literature exploring dark themes of loss and suffering, music that expressed anguish and pain. The professor explained that humans seemed to process their traumatic experiences through creative expression, that they took their darkest moments and transformed them into something they considered beautiful or meaningful. This ability to find value in suffering was alien to most species, who typically tried to forget or avoid painful experiences rather than commemorating them in art. The lecture moved to human philosophy and religion, topics that Professor Vexthor handled with the same clinical detachment he had shown throughout. He explained that humans had developed hundreds of different belief systems, many of which contained concepts of eternal punishment or cosmic struggle between good and evil. Some human religions, he noted, actually venerated suffering as a path to enlightenment or salvation. The professor showed images of human religious practices that involved fasting, physical discipline, or other forms of deliberate hardship undertaken willingly by believers. Then came perhaps the most disturbing segment of all. Professor Vexthor displayed information about human technological development in weapons and warfare. He showed the progression from simple clubs and spears to nuclear weapons capable of destroying entire planets. He explained that humans had developed these weapons while still confined to a single world, that they had created the means of their own extinction before even achieving spaceflight. The professor noted that humanity had come dangerously close to self-annihilation multiple times, with several incidents where nuclear war was avoided only by individual humans, choosing not to follow orders, or believing their detection systems were malfunctioning. The hologram showed the current human arsenal, weapons that Earth maintained even after joining the Galactic Union. Professor Vexthor explained that humans insisted on keeping their military capabilities despite living in a supposedly peaceful galaxy, citing their history as justification for maintaining readiness against potential threats. The professor suggested this represented either wisdom, born from hard experience, or an inability to move past their violent evolutionary heritage. Either way, it meant humans were among the most heavily armed species in the Union, relative to their population size. Professor Vexthor pulled up the final set of data, showing human expansion into space since first contact. In just the few years since joining the Galactic Union, humans had established colonies on worlds that other species considered too dangerous or too marginal to be worth the effort. Humans volunteered for the most hazardous missions, often in numbers that exceeded what was needed. Human engineers proposed modifications to existing technology that other species considered reckless. Human scientists wanted to study phenomena that regulations normally kept off limits. The pattern suggested a species that had not been tamed by access to galactic society, but rather saw it as a new frontier to push against. The lecture hall felt smaller somehow, the air heavier despite the filtration systems working perfectly. Cadets who had entered that morning with casual interest in learning about different species now sat rigid with what could only be described as fear. The accumulated weight of Professor Vexthor's presentation had built a picture of humanity as something dangerous and unpredictable, a species that by all reasonable measures should not have been admitted to the Galactic Union until they had matured beyond their violent and reckless tendencies. Jake sat in the back row feeling the weight of 200 stares even from those not directly looking at him. His hands were clenched so tightly that his knuckles had turned white, and he could feel his heart pounding in his chest with a rhythm that seemed too loud in the quiet hall. Zrix had withdrawn completely, his tentacles pulled tight against his body and his bioluminescence dimmed to almost nothing. Other cadets had created a visible empty space around Jake's position, seats abandoned as if he might explode at any moment. The Quilarian named Liz was trembling visibly, her prey species instincts clearly screaming at her to flee from the predator in the room. Professor Vexthor stood at his podium, his presentation complete, and asked if there were any questions. The silence was absolute. No one wanted to draw attention to themselves, and certainly no one wanted to risk angering the human by asking the questions that were clearly on everyone's mind. The professor's amber eyes swept across the auditorium and finally settled on Jake with an intensity that felt almost like a challenge. In that moment, something inside Jake crystallized into certainty. He could not let this stand, could not let his species be defined entirely by fear and misunderstanding. His chair scraped against the floor again as he stood, and this time he did not sit back down. He talked about human art and creativity, but not the dark examples Professor Vexthor had chosen. Jake showed paintings that celebrated beauty, music that expressed joy, literature that explored hope and connection. He explained that yes, humans created art about suffering, but they also created art about love, wonder, discovery, and triumph. Humans told stories to make sense of their world, to share experiences, to imagine better futures. They created beauty even in difficult circumstances, finding meaning and purpose through creative expression. Jake addressed human philosophy and belief systems, explaining that the diversity of human thought was a strength rather than a source of conflict in modern times. Humans had learned to coexist with different viewpoints, to debate ideas without violence, to find common values across different belief systems. The existence of multiple perspectives meant humans were good at seeing problems from different angles, at finding creative solutions that others might miss. Human philosophical traditions emphasized questions as much as answers, encouraging curiosity and critical thinking. The topic of human space exploration came up, and Jake's voice filled with genuine passion. He explained that humans had reached for the stars because they dreamed of something greater than themselves. The failures and disasters that Professor Vexthor had shown were not signs of recklessness, but evidence of determination. Humans learned from each failure, improved their designs, and tried again. The Voyager probes with their golden records were not foolish announcements to potential enemies, but messages of hope. Humanity reaching out to the universe with friendship and curiosity, despite having no guarantee of safety. Jake talked about human contributions to the Galactic Union since first contact. Human engineers had improved efficiency on several space station designs. Human medical researchers had made breakthroughs in treating conditions that affected multiple species. Human diplomats had helped mediate disputes between other species, their experience with conflict resolution proving valuable. Human volunteers had joined every major relief effort and exploration mission in the past few years. Humans were not taking from the galactic community, but contributing to it in meaningful ways. He concluded by addressing the fear he could see in the faces around him. Jake acknowledged that humans could be frightening when viewed through a lens of suspicion and worst-case scenarios. But he asked the cadets to consider whether any species would seem safe if presented only through their most dangerous qualities. He suggested that fear came from not understanding, and that understanding required looking beyond surface-level facts to see the reasons and context behind them. Humans were not monsters, Jake said quietly. They were people who had survived difficult circumstances and chosen to reach for something better. The lecture hall remained silent when Jake finished speaking. He stood at the podium, his heart still racing but his breathing steady, meeting the eyes of cadets throughout the room. Some still looked frightened, but others seemed thoughtful, reconsidering what they had heard earlier. Professor Vexthor had not interrupted once during Jake's speech, and now the Crithian stepped forward with an expression that might have been satisfaction. The professor's next words would determine whether Jake had made any difference at all, or had simply confirmed every fear the other cadets held about humans. Professor Vexthor's mandibles clicked together in a pattern that Jake had learned meant approval, and the Crithian's 4 amber eyes gleamed with something that looked remarkably like satisfaction. The professor stepped forward and placed one clawed hand on Jake's shoulder, a gesture that made several cadets gasp audibly. Vexthor's voice carried through the hall with a warmth that had been completely absent during his earlier lecture, and he began speaking directly to the assembled students about the true purpose of what they had just witnessed. The professor explained that his presentation had been deliberately one-sided, carefully constructed to provoke exactly the kind of response that Jake had provided. He told the cadets that understanding other species required looking beyond surface-level facts to comprehend the context and reasons behind their evolution and culture. Every species in the galaxy could seem monstrous when viewed only through their most dangerous or unusual characteristics. The point of his teaching method was to force students to confront their own biases and assumptions, to recognize how easily fear could replace understanding when information was presented without proper context. Vexthor revealed that he had been teaching xenobiology for 30 cycles, and every year he subjected a different species to the same treatment. Last semester he had horrified the class with details about Crithian biology, explaining their venomous bite, their ability to unhinge their jaws like earth snakes, and their ancestral practice of ritual combat that sometimes resulted in death. The semester before that he had focused on Palaxians, describing their hive mind capabilities and their ability to release bioelectric shocks strong enough to stun most creatures. Every species had aspects that seemed terrifying when stripped of context and presented as clinical facts. The professor gestured to Jake and asked him to remain at the podium, then began directing questions to the human cadet about topics that had not been covered in either presentation. Vexthor asked about human music, and Jake's face lit up as he described the incredible diversity of musical traditions across Earth. He talked about how humans created sounds that could make people dance or cry or feel inspired, how music was used for celebration and mourning and everything in between. He explained that humans had developed thousands of instruments and musical styles, each one reflecting different cultures and experiences. Jake pulled up examples on his data tablet, playing short clips of various musical genres, classical orchestras with dozens of musicians playing in perfect harmony, jazz ensembles improvising complex melodies, electronic music created with synthesizers and computers, traditional drums and flutes from indigenous cultures, rock bands with electric guitars. The variety was staggering, and several cadets leaned forward with genuine interest. Zrix's bioluminescent pattern shifted to a curious yellow, and his tentacles began moving in rhythm with one of the musical pieces. Professor Vexthor asked about human literature, and Jake described how humans told stories to make sense of their experiences and explore ideas. He explained that human literature included everything from ancient myths passed down through generations to modern science fiction imagining futures among the stars. Humans wrote about heroes and villains, love and loss, adventure and mystery, They explored philosophical questions through fiction, examined moral dilemmas through storytelling, and preserved their history through written accounts. Jake mentioned that many human stories emphasized compassion, sacrifice for others, and the triumph of hope over despair. The professor's next question focused on human family structures and child rearing, and Jake talked about how humans cared for their young for years, teaching them not just survival skills but values and knowledge. Human parents invested enormous time and energy into raising children, and extended family members often helped with this responsibility. He explained that humans formed strong bonds with their offspring and would go to extraordinary lengths to protect and provide for them. This investment in the next generation meant humans valued education, mentorship, and the passing down of accumulated wisdom. A Quilarian cadet named Liz, the same one who had appeared so frightened earlier, tentatively raised her hand and asked if humans were scared of other species. Jake laughed, a genuine sound that seemed to surprise many of the cadets, and admitted that yes, humans were often scared when encountering the unknown. He explained that fear was a natural response to unfamiliar situations, but humans tried not to let fear control their actions. He described courage as acting despite fear rather than the absence of fear, and said that most humans were actually quite nervous about meeting alien species for the first time. Jake talked about his own experience arriving at the academy, how overwhelming it had been to be surrounded by so many different species, each with their own way of communicating and interacting. He admitted that he had been terrified during his first week, worried about accidentally offending someone or making a mistake that would confirm negative stereotypes about humans. But his roommate Zrix had been patient and kind, helping him understand Palaxian customs and introducing him to other students. That kindness had made all the difference, and Jake had realized that most beings in the galaxy were simply people trying to get along with one another. Professor Vexthor asked about human friendship and social bonds, and Jake's expression softened as he considered the question. He explained that humans chose their friends based on shared interests, compatible personalities, and mutual respect. Friendships could form quickly or develop slowly over time, but once established, they often lasted for years or even entire lifetimes. Humans valued loyalty and friendship, supported friends through difficult times, and celebrated their successes. He described how friends became like chosen family, people who understood you and accepted you despite your flaws. Jake talked more about pack bonding, the trait that Professor Vexthor had presented as potentially dangerous. He explained that humans formed emotional connections easily, sometimes with unexpected things, but this was generally harmless and often beneficial. Humans bonded with pets, treating animals as family members and caring for them with genuine affection. They named their vehicles and ships, developing a sense of responsibility for maintaining them properly. They even bonded with plants, talking to them while watering them and feeling pride when they flourished. This capacity for attachment meant humans were rarely lonely and found meaning in relationships with the world around them. Other cadets began asking questions, their earlier fear gradually replaced by curiosity. A Thalorian cadet asked about human food and cooking, and Jake described the social aspect of sharing meals. He explained that humans often gathered around food, using mealtimes as opportunities to connect with family and friends. Cooking was considered both a practical skill and an art form, with humans developing complex recipes and techniques passed down through generations. Different cultures had distinct culinary traditions, and sharing food from one's culture was a way of sharing identity and heritage. A Dendari cadet asked about human relationships with nature, seeming confused about how a species could live on such a dangerous world, yet also appreciate its beauty. Jake explained that humans had a complicated relationship with Earth's environment. They recognized its dangers but also found it beautiful and worthy of protection. Many humans worked to preserve natural habitats and endangered species. They created parks and protected areas where wildlife could flourish. They studied ecosystems to understand how to live in balance with nature rather than in opposition to it. The fact that Earth was harsh made humans appreciate its beauty even more. Professor Vexthor announced a new assignment that would shape the entire semester. Each cadet would need to partner with someone from a completely different world classification, preferably a species they knew little about. The pairs would research each other's homeworlds, cultures, evolutionary pressures, and contributions to galactic society. The goal was not to catalog dangers or differences, but to understand strengths and find common ground. At the end of the semester, each pair would present their findings to the class, emphasizing what they had learned about cooperation and mutual understanding. The cadets began talking among themselves as they gathered their belongings. The atmosphere in the hall completely transformed from the tense fear that had dominated earlier. Several students approached Jake, some apologizing for their reactions during the lecture, and others asking questions about Earth and human culture. A few invited him to join their study groups or asked if he wanted to meet for lunch in the commissary. The change was remarkable, and Jake felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he had not fully realized he was carrying. Liz approached hesitantly, her long ears no longer flat against her head but upright and twitching with nervous energy. She asked if Jake would be willing to partner with her for the semester project, explaining that her people had evolved as prey species, and she wanted to understand the predator perspective better. However, she continued after hearing Jake speak, she realized he could explain that perspective with empathy and nuance rather than just presenting it as a threat. Jake agreed immediately, genuinely touched that she had overcome her fear enough to approach him. Zrix bounced over with his tentacles waving enthusiastically, his bioluminescent patterns flashing happy colors. The Palaxian said he had known all along that Jake would set things right, though his earlier anxiety suggested otherwise. Zrix suggested they all go to the commissary together, and soon a small group had formed around Jake, cadets from different species chatting and laughing as they headed toward the exit. The transformation from isolation to inclusion happened so naturally that Jake felt almost dizzy from the shift. Professor Vexthor called Jake back as the other students filed out, and the human cadet returned to the podium with some uncertainty. The Crithian's expression was warm as he thanked Jake for providing exactly the response he had hoped to see. Vexthor explained that he had reviewed Jake's application to the academy and had been impressed by his academic record and his stated desire to build bridges between species. The professor admitted that he had deliberately made his lecture even harsher than usual, knowing that if there was a human present, they would likely speak up to defend their species. The professor told Jake that the galaxy was changing rapidly with new species joining the Union at an unprecedented rate. Fear of the unknown was a natural response, but it could be overcome through education and personal interaction. Humans had a unique opportunity to serve as ambassadors not just for Earth, but for the principle that differences should be celebrated rather than feared. Vexthor said that Jake's willingness to stand up and provide context, to educate rather than simply argue, showed the kind of character that the Galactic Union needed in its future leaders. Jake left the lecture hall feeling like a completely different person than the one who had entered that morning. He caught up with the group heading to the commissary, joining Zrix and Liz and several other cadets whose names he was still learning. They walked across the academy grounds, passing beneath the twin suns that bathed everything in warm golden light. The buildings of the academy stretched toward the sky, architecture blending styles from dozens of different species into something uniquely galactic. As they walked, Jake thought about his family back on Earth, about his parents who had supported his decision to apply to the academy despite the risks. He thought about human history, about all the mistakes and violence and near-extinction events that had shaped his species. But he also thought about human capacity for growth and change, about the choice to reach for the stars despite not knowing what they would find there. Humans had survived Earth's dangers not through strength alone, but through cooperation and adaptability. And those same traits would help them find their place among the stars. In the commissary, Jake sat surrounded by beings from across the galaxy, sharing a meal and trading stories about their homeworlds. Liz asked questions about Earth seasons, fascinated by the concept of weather changing throughout the year. A Thalorian named Kess showed holographic images of his crystalline homeworld where entire cities were grown, rather than built. Zrix demonstrated some Palaxian bioluminescent communication, his skin flashing patterns that conveyed emotions too complex for words. The conversation flowed easily, barriers of fear and misunderstanding falling away as they simply talked and listened to one another. Jake realized that this was what Professor Vexthor had been trying to teach all along. Every species seemed strange or frightening when viewed only through the lens of their differences, but those differences became strengths when understood in context. Humans were strong because Earth's gravity demanded it, but that strength could protect others. Humans were resilient because Earth's dangers required it. But that resilience meant they could be counted on in crisis. Humans bonded easily because isolation meant death on Earth. But that bonding created loyal friends and dedicated teammates. The afternoon light shifted as the twin suns moved across the sky, and Jake felt more at home in this alien academy than he had since arriving. The future stretched before him full of possibility, a galaxy waiting to be explored and understood. Somewhere in the distance, new students were arriving at the academy, beings from worlds he had never heard of bringing their own unique perspectives and experiences. The Galactic Union continued its mission of bringing diverse species together, and Jake Morrison from Earth was proud to be part of that mission. Proof that understanding could overcome fear, and that cooperation could bridge any divide.